Good morning. Glad you could join me today. I have to wait a minute to see if the video is going to actually start, uh, but it records me even while I'm waiting. So looks like we're on now. So welcome again. Glad you could join me as we continue through Second Samuel. Now, if you're old enough, you remember the Watergate scandal from 1972 to 1974, and I was about 12, but I remember it. People from President Nixon's campaign team and some people in his administration, including his attorney general, had some people break into the Democratic Party's national headquarters at the Watergate building, and they broke in to plant bugs, listening devices, and then they went back another time to make repairs. But the second time, the lookout was watching a movie and he didn't notice when the police showed up. And by the time he saw the police car and radioed the warning to them, it was too late, and 5 men were arrested. The investigation went up the chain and finally implicated President Nixon in the cover up. And it seems that he didn't know anything about the burglary attempts, but he was involved in the cover up. And we had the famous tapes that he made in the Oval Office, and he obstructed the investigation. And eventually, there were congressional hearings, and there was going to be a vote to impeach him in the House of Representatives. And he was told that he was going to be convicted if it went that far. Uh, well, by then, he had won re-election. The election was in '72, and he this was in '74 when it came to a head. Uh, well, in the re-election, he had won 49 of the 50 states, and so you have to wonder why they were bothering to break into the Democratic Party's headquarters if they were winning by that much. They must have had some idea that it wasn't very close. And so the Watergate scandal, I think, is where we get the saying that the cover up is always worse than the crime. And it's also why we add gate to the end of all of the scandals now. So we may also come to a place in our lives where, because of paranoia, like President Nixon, or because of pride or complacency or boredom, like King David, we end up drifting into sin. And we do well to be alert and avoid the situation in the first place. But if we do slip, we should remember that the cover up can be worse than the sin. And so we're going to examine David's great sin and how he made it even worse when he tried to cover it up. And it's a good example to us or for us on how to avoid the sin in the first place by recognizing the circumstances that might lead to it, and then what we should do or not do if we end up not avoiding the sin, if we end up slipping into sin. So we're in 2 Samuel 11 today, and 2 Samuel 11 and 12 form a unit, and they're written in a chiastic manner. And chi is the Greek letter that looks like an RX, the English X. And when a passage is written chiastically, each successive part is indented until you reach the middle, and then they're unindented until you get back to the end. And so it looks like one side of a chi or of an X. And the parts of the X correspond with each other. And so the first part corresponds with the very last part. The second part corresponds to the next to the last part, and so on until you get to the middle. And often the middle part is the main or the most important part. And here the important part is 11:27b, and it says, the Lord was displeased with David, or what does it say here? the Lord was displeased with David, or what David had done was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Uh, and so that's at the end of chapter 11. And then chapter 12 shows how God deals with it. And it's hard to share stuff doing it this way, but I made this thing here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll leave it up there for a second, and you can pause the video. But that's the one side of the X. So I hope that came through a little bit. So we're going to see the setting, the crime or the sin, then the cover up, and the report, and then finally the outcome of this part of the story. So in 11:1, we have the setting for the incident, and we see how good times and comfort can set us up for spiritual failure. And so it says there, then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they brought destruction on the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed in Jerusalem. And so we saw the sons of Ammon at the end of chapter 10, when David sent messengers, not the end of chapter 10, in chapter 10, David had sent the messengers to console the new king of Ammon because of his father's death. And the new king's commanders told him, well, they're not here to console you. They're here to spy out your city so David can overthrow it. And so the king shaved off half of the men's beards and cut their robes up in the back to the middle, so their buttocks were exposed, and then sent them on their way. It's very humiliating for them. Well, David attacked the city after this king hired additional mercenaries, and when the attack came, the mercenaries ran off, and the men of Ammon went back inside the city and apparently shut the gate, and Joab went home. When they did that, apparently he didn't want to besiege the city, and so perhaps it was the wrong time of the year to do that. So we're continuing to see the results or the consequences from David starting this war, because the king of Ammon humiliated him by humiliating his messengers. We could say that the king of Ammon started the war, and that would be true, but David is king of God's people, and he is expected to act in accordance with God's will. So now in chapter 11, it's the right time for war in the spring, and so David sends Joab and the whole army over to the city of Ammon, Rabbah, and they lay siege to the city. And it's not totally clear to me that this is the very same city as before, but it is a city of the Ammonites. But the writer says David stays in Jerusalem. Now, there's some disagreement among Bible scholars as to whether David should have gone out to war with his troops. On the one hand, the thinking is, well, if he had gone to war like he should have, then he wouldn't have been in Jerusalem to be tempted. Leading troops into battle was expected of ancient Near East rulers. But on the other hand, he is king, and maybe he had responsibilities in Jerusalem, and so it's not that strange that he stayed there and sent the army over to fight the war. And so I always kind of figure if there's good scholars on both sides of a disputable matter, then we can decide which one we think is best. In the last chapter, there was one time when David didn't go with the troops. That's when they went to fight Hanun, the king who had humiliated David's messengers. And then later they went to fight the Arameans, and David went along that time. And the Arameans were more formidable, a more formidable foe. And David's been king for a while now, and so maybe he picks and chooses when he's going to go to war along with the troops. Now, when he was younger, he would have gone every time. And so he's getting sort of comfortable being king, and that's part of the problem. So in 11:2 to 5, we have the crime, or maybe we should say the sin. And so that's in 11:2 to 5. It says, Now at evening time, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent servants and inquired about the woman, and someone said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Then David sent messengers and had her brought. And when she came to him, he slept with her. And when she had purified herself from uncleanness, she returned to her house. But the woman conceived. So she sent word and informed David and said, I am pregnant. Excuse me. Well, since David's not out with the troops, he has time on his hands, and he was lying in his bed, but he gets up to walk around on the roof. And coincidentally, there is a very beautiful woman bathing within his field of vision, and so he can see her from his roof. And so, is it a test by God, or is it a temptation from Satan? Maybe it's just a coincidence. I don't think there's very many coincidences in the Bible. Now, there's no real explicit judgment about the woman, so perhaps this was a normal thing for her to be doing. A suspicious mind, like an attorney, could think that she knew David walked around on his roof sometimes, and so she's sort of putting him out there, putting herself out there for him to see. But the writer doesn't say this or even really hint at it, and so her role in the sin in the situation is not the focus of the story. Well, David is king, and so he sends servants to inquire about this woman. And in the rest of the chapter, the word send or sent is used a number of times. I counted 10, and but they're not all spoken by David. But it's used frequently, and so your ears kind of perk up when you hear it. Well, they report back, well, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, Eliam might have been the son of Ahithophel, who was one of David's counselors. And we don't know yet who Uriah the Hittite is, but he's one of David's warriors. He's off at the battle with Joab while David's at home sleeping with his wife. So David is king and he wants her. So he sends messengers and has her brought to him, and he sleeps with her. Well, naturally, Bathsheba gets pregnant and sends words to David that I'm pregnant. And now in verse 4, it said that here in the NASB, that when she had purified herself, she went home. And so the NASB implies she purified herself after having sex with David. But according to a lot of commentators, the language would be better translated that she had purified herself before she came to David's. And so that would have been purification from her menstrual period, and that is why she was bathing on the roof when David saw her. And that would mean it was impossible that Uriah could be the father of the child, because he had gone off to war before she had her period. So that makes a little bit of sense. Well, that's the crime or the sin. David has committed adultery with Bathsheba, and now she's become pregnant, and she's not going to be able to hide that for very long. And everyone is going to know that Uriah the Hittite is not the father. Probably a lot of people knew that she had been summoned to the king's palace, and so they would suspect something. Well, David is the king, and so he sends word to Joab to send Uriah back to Jerusalem. And Joab obeys, and he sends Uriah back. And so David is going to try to cover up his sin, and that's in verses 6 to 13. It says, Then David sent word to Joab, Send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked about Joab's well-being and that of the people and the condition of the war. Then David said to Uriah, Go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah left the king's house, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. Now, when they informed David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said to David, The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Should I then go to my house and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? By your life and the life of your soul, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, Stay here today also, and tomorrow I will let you go back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the day after. Now David summoned Uriah, and he ate and drank in his presence, and he made Uriah drunk. And in the evening Uriah went out to lie on his bed with the Lord's servants, and he still did not go down to his house. So first of all, David tells Uriah to go home and wash his feet, and that could be a euphemism for sleeping with Bathsheba. And so David's hoping Uriah will do this, and then it can be claimed that the baby is Uriah's. But Uriah sleeps at the door of the king's house with the other servants. And David tells him a second time to go home, but Uriah says, Well, I can't possibly do that because the rest of the army is at war. And also, if he had slept with his wife, he would have become ritually unclean and unable to fight in the war. And so sex was kind of to be avoided during war by the soldiers. And yet here is his king asking him to do this. Well, that fails too, so David gets Uriah drunk. But Uriah still does not go to his own home and sleep with his wife Bathsheba. Now, it shouldn't be lost on us that Uriah the Hittite is proving himself to be more righteous than David, the king of Israel. And so it's not a very pretty picture of David. Well, since David's ploy to get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba didn't work, he decides he's going to have to kill him. And so we have a second crime or a second sin. Actually, we have a third sin if we count the first one where David coveted his neighbor's wife. And this third sin then is in verses 14 to 21. So in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He had written in the letter the following: Station Uriah on the front line of the fiercest battle and pull back from him, so that he may be struck and killed. So it was, as Joab kept watch on the city, that he stationed Uriah at the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city went out and fought against Joab, and some of the people among David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent a messenger and reported to David all the events of the war. He ordered the messenger, saying, When you have finished telling all the events of the war to the king, then it shall be that if the king's wrath rises and he says to you, Why did you move against the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Did a woman not throw an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died at Thebez? Why did you move against the wall? Then you shall say, Your servant Uriah the Hittite also died. So the messenger departed and came and reported to David everything that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men prevailed against us and came out against us in the field, but we pressed them as far as the entrance of the gate." Guess I went a little too far there. So ironically, David sends Uriah back to the war, and he sends a letter to Joab with him. And so Uriah carries the very letter that instructs Joab to arrange for the enemy to kill Uriah. Maybe Uriah couldn't read, that's possible, or David just trusted him to be a loyal soldier. Uh, the instructions are for Joab to put Uriah at the front, at the fiercest part of the battle where the enemy's soldiers are the best. And then he'll pull back from the enemy, leaving Uriah at the front, so he'll end up being killed by the enemy. And Joab dutifully obeys, and Uriah is killed. But so were some of David's other servants. And I take that to mean other soldiers. So not only is Uriah killed, but other soldiers are killed as part of the cover up. So Joab sends this messenger to report to David and tells him that if David gets angry at the strategy that was employed, the messenger should say, "And your servant Uriah also died." And then in verses 22 to 25, the messenger reports back to David and says there again, "So the messenger departed and came and reported to David everything that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, 'The men prevailed against us and came out against us in the field, but we pressed them as far as the entrance of the gate. Also, the archers shot at your servants from the wall, so some of the king's servants died, and your servant Uriah the Hittite also died.' Then David said to the messenger, 'This is what you shall say to Joab. Do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Fight with determination against the city and overthrow it, and thereby encourage him.'" So David got what he wanted, and he tells the messenger to go back and say to Joab, "Well, don't worry about it. The sword devours one as well as another." It's not a very nice thing for the king to say, because he had wanted Uriah to be killed. That's bad enough, but then other soldiers were killed as well. But this might encourage Joab to finish the war now that he's been the cause of people dying. And then in verses 26 and 27, we see Bathsheba's reaction and the Lord's reaction. And it says there, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah was dead, she mourned for her husband. When the time of mourning was over, David sent servants and had her brought to his house, and she became his wife. Then she bore him a son. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Bathsheba mourns for Uriah's death, and there's a prescribed period for this, apparently about 7 days. And so David would have known when the mourning period was over. And so then he sends servants and has her brought to him, and they are married, and she has a son. And, it would seem by now that the public would know what had happened. Well, the Lord's reaction is short, excuse me, and to the point. It says, "But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord." And so the outcome is that Uriah has been killed, David has married Bathsheba, and she has given birth to a son. But what David has done is evil in the sight of the Lord. And remember that statement, it was in the middle of our chiastic structure. And so we'll see the other half next week in chapter 12. Well, in his book, David, Chuck Swindoll says one Our most difficult times are when things are not when things are going hard. I should start over. Our most difficult times are not when things are going hard. Hard times create dependent people. You don't get proud when you're dependent on God. Survival keeps you humble. Pride happens when everything is swinging in your direction. And everything is going well for David. But this gives rise to pride and complacency. He doesn't go to war with his troops. He sees a beautiful woman bathing next door to his palace, and he thinks, well, I've got to have her. Never mind that she's married and married to one of his loyal soldiers. He is king, and he can have what he wants. Now, we should observe that David is king under the covenant that God made with Moses and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And as king, he's expected to obey the covenant. And by doing this, he would bring blessings on his people. Well, the Ten Commandments are part of the covenant, and he's broken at least three of them. Three of the Ten Commandments are you shall not covet, you shall not commit adultery, and you shall not murder. He also broke the two big commands that summarize all of the law. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so David has been described as a man after God's own heart, but he fell prey to the same condition that God warned the nation of Israel about. Moses told them in Deuteronomy 8:11 to 14 and 17, he said, be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his commandments, his ordinances, and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, and you build good houses and live in them, and when your herds and your flocks increase, and your silver and gold increase, and everything that you have increases, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Remember God, otherwise you may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. So this is fallen human nature. When we are in need, we rely on God. But when God makes things go well for us, we forget about him and start thinking that we are the ones who made it happen. And that is when we are vulnerable to temptation. Well, Satan, of course, is on the lookout for this condition, or maybe he helps arrange it, and he's ready to pounce. And that's why the Apostle Peter wrote in 1 Peter 5:8, be of sober spirit and be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And so if David had been of sober spirit and on the alert, he would have turned away when he saw that woman from his rooftop. Or having fallen into sin, he would have repented and made it right. But he didn't, and we'll see the long-term consequences of this in upcoming chapters. So the setting for the story was Jerusalem, when David was walking around on his roof and saw a beautiful neighbor. He sends for her and commits adultery, and she gets pregnant. Well, now David needs a cover-up, and so he sends for the woman's husband, Uriah the Hittite, and tries to get him to sleep with his wife, so that there will be plausible deniability. But Uriah, a Hittite, proves to be more righteous than David, the king of Israel, and he refuses to sleep with his wife while the army is at war. And so David obviously has no choice. He sends Uriah back to the war with instructions for Joab, David's commander, to put Uriah in the front of the fiercest fighting and then pull back and let the enemy kill him. Well, Joab obeys, and after Uriah is killed, he sends a messenger to report to David. Uh, and David says, well, go back and tell Joab not to feel bad. The sword devours one as well as the other. And then, after Bathsheba mourns for the appropriate time, David sends for her and marries her, and she has a son. And so that is the outcome. But there's one more outcome. The Bible says, but the thing David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And chapters 11 and 12 are a unit, and they're written in that chiastic structure. And so the statement that the thing that David did was evil in the sight of the Lord is in the middle of the chiasm of the one side of the X. And that's usually the most important part of the passage when it's written in a chiastic manner. So next time we'll get to see the other half of the chiasm in chapter 12. Well, President Nixon, he was president, and he was rolling to a 49 state electoral wipeout of his opponent in the 1972 election. But for some unknown reason, his people decided to break into the Democratic National headquarters at the Watergate building. They got busted, and Nixon and his other people decided they need to cover up the crime. As they say, the cover up is worse than the crime, and the cover up eventually led to Nixon resigning from the presidency. Well, Nixon was a little paranoid, but our problems will usually be when we have had a lot of success and we're very proud of ourselves and we become complacent. And so, again, as Chuck Swindoll says, our most difficult times are not when things are going hard. Hard times create dependent people. You don't get proud when you're dependent on God. Survival keeps you humble. Pride happens when everything is swinging in your direction. And so little things can lead to big problems if we do not stay on the alert. The Apostle Peter says, our adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And so be on the alert and remain dependent on God. Excuse me. All right, well, that's 2 Samuel chapter 11, and we'll do chapter 12 next time. But let's have a word of prayer, and then we will sign off. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the story of David and what it teaches us. Pray that we will be on the alert and sober and watching out for things that can tempt us to lead us astray, for the devil to pounce on us. Help us to turn away from those things, to do about what we should be doing, not like David staying in Jerusalem when maybe he should have been at war. But we need you. We need to be dependent on you, so that we avoid these things that so easily tempt us and lead us astray. Pray your blessing on all the folks who tune into this, that your word will get in their hearts, and they will follow you more closely. And if they haven't put their trust in Jesus for salvation, that you would lead them to do that. And we pray all this in his name. Amen. Amen. All right. Well, have a great week, and I hope to see you back here next week.